Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something really fascinating and, well, complex. What happens when different cultural groups come together, often through immigration?
Right, and this coexistence, it's not always equal footing, is it? There are often power dynamics involved.
Exactly. So to help us navigate this, we're leaning on Barry's ideas from 2008 definitions like cultural group, dominant, and non-dominant. And the key thing is we're trying not to just assume the non-dominant groups simply blend in or assimilate.
That's crucial. And the sources we're digging into today, they really get into the nitty-gritty of how people, manage these cultural shifts.
And how their sense of self, their identity changes through all this.
Precisely. It covers a lot from adapting to a new culture, what we call acculturation, right through to personal identity crises at different life stages.
Okay. So our goal for this deep dive is essentially to pull out the main takeaways. How do individuals and even whole societies adapt when cultures meet?
And how does our own personal identity get shaped or maybe reshaped in these contexts? We want to make these, well, sometimes tricky processes a bit clearer.
Sounds good. Let's unpack this. Where's the best place to start making sense of it all?
Well, I think a natural starting point is that process you mentioned, acculturation. Barry's model from 2008 is really helpful here.
Okay.
He doesn't see it as just, people passively absorbing a new culture.
Yeah.
It's more dynamic. Individuals are actively interpreting their experiences.
Right, actively making sense of it. And within that, Barry talks about three sub-processes happening, doesn't he?
Yes, exactly. He describes first culture shedding, sort of letting go of some old ways.
Makes sense.
Then there's culture learning, picking up new ways, new behaviors that work better in the new setting.
Okay. Shedding and learning.
And the third is culture conflict. This can happen as people try to navigate these changes, balancing the old and the new.
Conflict sounds, well, stressful.
It can be. But Barry also points out that if these experiences aren't too difficult, people often reach what he calls adjustment, basically adapting to the wider society with minimal friction.
So it's not just about taking on the new, but this active negotiation.
Absolutely. It underscores that it's not just passive acceptance, but an active, sometimes really challenging process. And it can lead to different outcomes, not just everyone becoming the same.
But like you said, it's not always smooth sailing, right? Conflict can arise.
Precisely. And Barry does say that if conflict happens and the person resolves it by, well, yielding to the dominant group's norms, that's when you get assimilation.
Ah, okay. So assimilation is one possible outcome of that conflict.
Yes, but it's important to remember his main point. It's not the only outcome. Cultural diversity often persists.
That makes sense. So, okay, alongside acculturation, we need to think about adaptation. And our sources say this is actually like multifaceted, not just one thing.
Spot on. A. Canterbury's research from '95 really dives into this. They draw a distinction between psychological adaptation.
Which is like your mental well-being, how you're feeling inside.
Exactly. Your overall sense of well-being, mental and physical health. And then there's sociocultural adaptation.
Okay, and that's more the practical side?
Yeah, how well you manage the day-to-day stuff in the new cultural setting, getting things done, interacting effectively.
So feeling good versus like functioning well day to day, are they totally separate?
Not completely. They found they are distinct, but they do influence each other. There's a moderate correlation, something like 0.4 to 0.5.
Okay, so related, but not the same thing.
Right. And crucially, they often have different timelines and different predictors. Psychological problems might spike initially, then maybe decrease or fluctuate. Sociocultural adaptation, though, generally tends to improve more steadily over time.
Interesting. And what sort of things predict how well someone adapts psychologically versus socioculturally?
Well, for the psychological side, feeling okay, things like your personality traits, big life events happening, and crucially, how much social support you have, those seem really important.
Right, your personal resources and network.
Exactly. For sociocultural adaptation managing daily life, our sources suggest other factors are more key, though they don't always specify what in detail.
Okay. Now, there's also another view on adaptation mentioned, focusing more on specific problems over time.
Yes. Ho's perspective from 1995. It shifts the focus to the actual concrete challenges people run into, like initially, maybe language barriers, finding work, finding a place to live.
Really practical hurdles first.
Right. And then later, it might be more about building social connections, finding fulfilling ways to spend leisure time.
That feels very grounded.
It does. And it really emphasizes that the timeline for adaptation isn't fixed. It varies a lot based on the person's own resources, resilience, skills, whatever, and also the opportunities or lack thereof in the new society.
Yeah, you wouldn't expect everyone to follow the exact same path.
Definitely not. And then we have to factor in the impact of prejudice and discrimination. This comes up quite strongly.
Yeah, that seems critical.
Our sources, like Fenton and Halpern, they're very clear. Experiencing prejudice significantly harms well-being. It's a major stressor.
And Beiser and colleagues flagged this as an added risk, specifically during acculturation, didn't they?
Yes, an extra layer of difficulty on top of everything else.
Now, I remember Murphy back in '65 suggested that maybe in more diverse, plural societies there might be less prejudice.
He did suggest that. But later sources kind of push back on that optimistic view. Berry and Kalin in '95 found that prejudice is definitely still a reality in plural societies.
So diversity doesn't automatically erase prejudice.
Apparently not. And Fernando in '93 went even further, arguing that racism is a major obstacle, a really significant risk factor for the mental health of immigrants.
Wow, that's quite sobering.
It really is.
So, okay, we have this active acculturation process, these different facets of adaptation, and this overlay of potential prejudice. How does Berry try to sort of sequence these potential outcomes?
Well, Berry in 2008 proposes a kind of hierarchy, or maybe a potential sequence. First, he suggests, come behavioral shifts, just learning the ropes of daily life.
Learning how to act in the new culture.
Right. If that doesn't go smoothly, if there's friction, it can lead to stress in interactions. Then you need coping mechanisms to avoid what he terms acculturative stress.
Okay, so stress is the next potential stage if things are difficult.
Yeah. And if those difficulties become overwhelming, if the stress is too much to cope with, then more serious issues, unfortunately including psychopathology or mental health problems, could arise.
That seems like a logical progression of increasing difficulty. But he notes we need more research to really nail down that sequence.
Absolutely. He emphasizes the need for big, long-term studies that follow different groups over time and measure all these things together. It's complex to track.
Makes sense.
But the overall takeaway seems to be that, look, most individuals do adapt positively in the long run. But the transition itself, it usually involves challenges. It's a risk factor, as Beiser and others said, but it doesn't predetermine a bad outcome.
Okay, that provides a really solid framework for understanding acculturation and adaptation. Let's shift gears a bit now to the other huge piece of the puzzle, identity. And Erik Erikson's work is just foundational here, isn't it?
Absolutely essential. His concept of ego identity really started, interestingly enough, from his clinical work, particularly observing veterans after World War II.
What did he notice?
He saw men who had, in a way, lost their anchor. They'd lost that feeling of being the same person over time, that sense of personal continuity with their past, this deep inner disruption, this feeling of not knowing who you are anymore. That's what he linked to a weakened ego identity.
And from there, from those specific observations, he kind of broadened it out to identity confusion, especially thinking about younger people.
That's right. He saw a similar kind of core struggle in youth who were, conflicted, maybe rebellious or getting into trouble, an internal battle. He identified identity confusion as this central disturbance, calling it an acute crisis, but one that could potentially pass.
And this led to the more general idea of the identity crisis that we often associate with teenagers and young adults.
Exactly. That became seen as a more sort of normative or expected challenge during that period of life.
It's interesting, though, how terms like identity and identity crisis, which started so personally, get applied much more broadly now. Like, people talk about a national identity crisis or a crisis for a social group. Erikson himself was a bit cautious about that, wasn't he?
He was. He explicitly questioned if you can really equate an individual's identity crisis with, say, the adolescence of a whole nation or a field of study. He suggested those might be more like analogies.
A good reminder to be careful with the comparisons.
Definitely.
Something that really jumped out at me from Erikson is this idea that forming an identity involves active tension. It's not passive.
That's such a key insight. Erikson really stresses it's an ongoing effort. You have to constantly sort of hold your own, as he put it, without any guarantee of success. It's a striving, a dynamic process.
And he also connects gaining a strong identity to maybe breaking free from a dominant group's identity. That links back nicely to our earlier discussion.
It really does. He mentions Freud apparently suppressing his national enthusiasm, and he talks about this concept of a negative identity, things we define ourselves against that can kind of haunt us.
So it's not just about what you are, but also what you aren't.
Precisely. It suggests our sense of self is built both by embracing connections and by distancing ourselves from things we reject.
So how does this actually happen? Is forming an identity something we consciously decide to do, according to Erikson?
Well, he argues it's largely unconscious. We're not usually thinking, okay, time to build my identity. It tends to surface into consciousness during times he called identity consciousness.
When might that happen?
Often when there's inner turmoil, or maybe big external changes or challenges. That's when we suddenly become very aware of the question, who am I? Or who am I becoming?
And it's not like you reach a point where your identity is done. It keeps evolving.
Exactly. He saw it as a continuous process of becoming more differentiated, more uniquely you throughout life. And it's constantly influenced by the people who are important to us. That circle widens as we grow.
So the adolescent crisis is maybe the most intense period, but it's part of a lifelong journey.
Right. And it always interacts with our personal growth and also with changes in our community or society. He called this psychosocial relativity. Our identity shapes society, and society shapes our identity.
He also made a link between identity formation and how society set up norms and routines, how daily life becomes kind of ritualized. How does that connection work?
Erikson suggested that these shared routines, these daily tasks and rituals, they provide a sort of scaffolding for identity. They give us coordinates, a sense of belonging, shared meaning.
But he also saw a downside.
Yes, he pointed out that these same structures and rituals can also create divisions, compartments, and inequalities within society.
And chillingly, he suggested that when large groups feel their core identity is threatened, young people might be particularly drawn to, well, extreme ideologies. Things like intense nationalism or racism that offer a very strong, albeit synthetic, sense of identity.
Yes, that's a really powerful point. He connects this vulnerability to the deep fear of identity loss, the fear of dissolving into ambiguity. And he saw how that fear could be manipulated, potentially leading to organized violence or terror. It feels very relevant today, unfortunately.
It really does. Now, Erikson is famous for his stages of psychosocial development. Can you give us a quick refresher on the stages leading up to adolescence?
Sure, there are 8 stages in total. It starts in infancy with basic trust versus mistrust learning if the world is reliable. Then early childhood is autonomy versus shame and doubt, developing a sense of independence. Preschool age brings initiative versus guilt, exploring and doing things, but risking guilt if they go too far. Then school age is industry versus inferiority, learning to be competent and productive, making things.
Got it. Trust, autonomy, initiative, industry, and then comes adolescence.
Right. Adolescence is the pivotal stage for identity versus role confusion. This is the main event, you could say, for identity formation. The core task is integrating all those earlier identification skills and potentials into a coherent sense of self.
And that's challenging
Because you're faced with so many conflicting possibilities. And societal pressures are immense. Trying to figure out who you really are amidst all that is the central struggle.
And what comes after that, briefly?
Young adulthood is about intimacy versus isolation, the ability to form close, committed relationships versus becoming isolated. Adulthood focuses on generativity versus stagnation, contributing to the next generation, leaving a legacy. And maturity involves integrity versus despair, looking back on life with acceptance or regret.
Erikson also coined the term psychosocial moratorium for adolescence. What's that about?
Think of it like a timeout, a period of delay. Society often grants young people a bit of leeway, a space to experiment with different roles, beliefs, and relationships without having to make permanent commitments just yet.
Like a permitted breathing space.
Exactly. It's characterized by a degree of societal permissiveness and youthful playfulness. But the idea is that this exploration eventually leads to more solid commitments. It's crucial for figuring things out.
And lastly, regarding adolescence, he mentioned the polarization of sexual differences. What did he mean there?
He observed that during adolescence, as part of consolidating identity, there's often a strong need to feel clearly like a member of one sex or the other. Uncertainty or confusion about one's gender identity can be a source of significant distress and potentially lead to fixation during this stage.
Okay, so let's zoom in on identity confusion itself. What are the key signs, according to Erikson?
He described it as a real loss of that inner compass, that ego perspective. It leads to a deep mistrust of time itself, difficulty planning, anticipating the future, feeling connected to one's past. He actually linked this back to an infant's initial lack of time sense.
That's a deep connection. And the intense self-consciousness of adolescence, he saw that as related to.
Yes, kind of like a reemergence of the infant's doubt about whether caregivers are trustworthy. But now the doubt expands. Can I trust my own childhood experiences? Can I trust the social world around me? It leads to that intense focus on how others see you.
And what about rigidly clinging to one specific role, what he called role fixation? How is that a sign of confusion?
It seems counterintuitive, right? But Erikson suggested that this kind of total rigid commitment without any real exploration isn't true identity achievement. It's often a defense against the anxiety of confusion. It's like choosing a pre-made identity to avoid the hard work of finding your own, possibly linked to unresolved earlier conflicts around initiative versus guilt.
That makes sense. It's a kind of premature closing off. And finally, this striking concept, the choice of the negative identity. What does that involve?
This is when a young person seems to deliberately embrace an identity that is precisely the opposite of what's expected or valued by their family or community. It's a scornful hostility towards the roles offered.
Can you give an example?
Erikson mentions a young man who felt much more at home, more himself, with people in poor neighborhoods than he did at his affluent college or with his own family. It's actively defining yourself against the mainstream or expected path. You see it a lot, don't you? That need to push back.
Absolutely. A powerful way to assert oneself, even if negatively. Okay, let's pivot again. How has research actually tried to study identity development? James Marcia's model from 1966 seems really influential.
Hugely influential. Marcia took Erikson's ideas, specifically the concepts of crisis and commitment, and made them more operational, more measurable for research.
So crisis meaning actively exploring options.
Right. Wrestling with choices, exploring alternatives in areas like occupation or ideology. And commitment, meaning the degree of personal investment you've made in those choices.
And based on whether someone has experienced a crisis, explored, and made a commitment, Marcia proposed 4 distinct identity statuses.
Exactly. You have identity achievement they've explored and committed. Moratorium they're actively exploring. In crisis, but haven't committed yet. Foreclosure they've committed but without exploring, often just adopting parental or societal values. And diffusion, neither exploring nor committed, kind of adrift.
And the moratorium status sounds like a really active, maybe turbulent time.
Very much so. Marcia described people in moratorium as being in the midst of that struggle. Their commitments are vague, they're often preoccupied with adolescent issues, trying to find a compromise between, say, what their parents want, what society demands, and what they feel capable of. There's a lot of uncertainty there.
Thinking about cultural integration, you could imagine people navigating different cultural expectations, perhaps spending significant time in that moratorium state.
That's a very plausible connection, yeah. Trying to reconcile different value systems could definitely prolong that exploration phase.
And Marcia actually tested these statuses. He did a study linking them to performance on a cognitive task, a concept attainment task, or CIT. What came out of that?
The results were quite clear. They supported the idea that a more consolidated identity relates to more effective cognitive functioning. People in the identity achievement status did significantly better on the CAT overall score, time spent thinking, fewer guesses compared to those in identity diffusion.
Interesting. So having a clearer sense of self seems linked to better focus and problem solving.
That seems to be the implication. Marcia also found the identity achievement folks persevered longer on the task and had more realistic goals for themselves. They also tended to be somewhat less authoritarian and had less vulnerable self-esteem.
Now, our sources also remind us to consider the bigger picture, the cultural and historical context. Fadjikov and colleagues raised some important points about how limited identity options used to be.
They really did. It's a crucial reminder. For most of human history, maybe 5,000 years or more, your choices about who you'd become were incredibly restricted. Who you'd marry, often arranged. Your work, probably follow your parents, your beliefs, whatever the local elders taught.
We forget how recent our level of choice actually is.
Absolutely. And they argue that even today, for many young people in developing parts of the world, life conditions are maybe closer to our collective past than to life in developed nations' limited options, restricted meat selection, less ideological diversity to choose from.
So the whole idea of an identity crisis might be a product of having choices in the first place. But how do these wider forces, like history and culture, actually shape the options available?
Well, globalization is a massive factor now. Our sources talk about how urbanization, often young people moving to cities, brings them smack into contact with global economic values, independence, consumerism, individual choice.
And technology connects them globally, too.
Right. Media technologies link young people everywhere. So someone growing up in a rapidly changing place might start seeing global culture as their future. maybe feeling disconnected from their local traditions.
There was that example of young Chinese migrants embracing individualism and consumerism in cities while still having to deal with traditional family expectations and state demands.
Exactly. That highlights the complex negotiation involved navigating global influences alongside local or national ones. It's a real balancing act for identity.
Given all this complexity, though, the sources also critique how identity is often studied, right? Like maybe questionnaires don't capture everything.
That's a fair point raised. Questionnaires have been the backbone of a lot of identity research, and they give us valuable data, but they might oversimplify things. They might miss the nuances, the personal stories, the unique ways individuals make sense of their identity.
So, what's suggested as a potentially richer way to understand it?
The narrative method gets highlighted. This means using qualitative research, focusing on people's personal stories, how they construct the narrative of their own lives, and identity development.
Getting the story behind the numbers.
Pretty much. Sources like Schwartz and colleagues suggest that the ideal might be to combine methods, use quantitative tools like questionnaires to see broad patterns in relationships, but also use qualitative approaches like interviews to understand the individual experiences and meanings behind those patterns.
That makes a lot of sense. You need both the big picture and the close-up view for something as personal as identity. Okay, let's zoom back out one last time. Erikson saw identity as relevant to understanding big social issues and movements, didn't he?
Yes, absolutely. He directly connected it to understanding things like the civil rights movement in the U.S. or other emancipation movements globally. He even quoted Nehru, saying that Gandhi gave India an identity. It's about collective self-definition, too.
He also drew a contrast between how some white thinkers talked about identity versus how early Black writers often described it. What was the point there?
He noted that figures like William James or Freud might talk about identity in positive assertive terms. But early Black writers, like W.E.B. Du Bois, often expressed a sense of invisibility, of being unheard, and identity in torment, as Erikson put it.
A painful starting point for identity.
Yes, but Erikson provocatively suggested that maybe this identity forged in struggle, in facing injustice, could actually hold a kind of essential superiority, or at least a deeper insight, compared to more comfortable, complacent identities.
That's a really challenging idea, and Erikson also talked about this concept of pseudospecies. What's the danger there?
Pseudospecies is that deep, often unconscious conviction that your own group, your tribe, your nation, your culture is inherently superior, maybe even the only true humans. Erikson believed its roots lie deep in our tribal past and get reinforced through childhood socialization.
And the danger is when this belief gets amplified.
Exactly. He warned that when you combine this pseudospecies thinking with modern technology, a strong sense of moral righteousness, and fierce territoriality about identity, it becomes incredibly dangerous. It can fuel horrific intergroup conflict. He pointed to Nazi Germany as an extreme, terrifying example of this kind of mass delusion. It's like extreme sports fandom, but for your whole group identity, we are the best, they are inherently flawed or lesser.
He also noted how cultural symbols can change meaning over time, using the blues as an example.
Right. Something like the blues, which might have originated as an expression of resilience and shared identity within a specific community facing hardship, could later, in a different social climate, be reinterpreted mainly as a symbol of past oppression or discrimination. Meanings aren't static.
And societal structures themselves have a direct impact. He mentioned the historical denial of responsible fatherhood roles to Black men in America.
A crucial point. He highlighted how systemic injustices like that don't just affect economics or politics. They can fundamentally disrupt personality development and the formation of a stable, positive sense of self, perpetuating cycles of disadvantage.
Finally, he talked about a totalistic rearrangement of identity, where negative elements become dominant. That example with the white woman reacting to Black power imagery was striking.
It really was. It illustrates how fear and ingrained negative stereotypes associated with a group can lead someone to perceive any assertion of that group's identity, even positive assertions, as threatening. It shows how difficult it can be to overcome those deeply embedded biases and allow for new positive identity expressions.
So wrapping up Erikson, his main point is that we really need to understand identity and identity confusion across multiple levels, individual case histories, life stories, but also within the broader sweep of history and social forces.
Absolutely. He stressed the clinical method's value in uncovering unconscious processes, but also called for interdisciplinary thinking to tackle these complex social problems where psychology and society intertwine so deeply.
Wow. This has genuinely been a deep dive. We've covered so much ground: the dynamics of cultural contact, acculturation strategies, the different sides of adaptation, and this complex, evolving nature of identity, especially through Erikson's lens and the research that followed.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Seeing the interplay between how people adapt practically and psychologically, and how their sense of self is shaped by both personal journeys and these huge societal forces.
And we've really seen that tension between how identity might have been constrained historically and the explosion of options, maybe sometimes overwhelming options that people face in our more globalized world today.
Yeah, that contrast is stark. From limited choices to almost too many choices, perhaps.
So here's something to leave you, our listener, thinking about. Considering this relentless pace of cultural change, technological advancement, everything speeding up, how might these processes we've talked about, identity formation, adaptation, how might they continue to change in the coming decades?
That's a great question. What new challenges might emerge for individuals and societies? But also, could there be new opportunities in how we navigate who we are and how we relate to each other in these shifting landscapes?
We encourage you to think about your own experiences, what you see around you in light of everything we've dug into today. Thanks so much for joining us on the Deep Dive.